Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rose and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. This week, we're talking about the recent spring meetings of the IMF that took place in Washington, D.C. Last week from an article titled When Complacency Abounds, Moral Hazard Reigns Supreme. So, Brunella, you were in D.C. in person witnessing these meetings. What did you see on the ground? Give us the bird's eye view.
Yeah, I mean, as usual, there were lots of people from all around the world. Themes of the discussions are the hottest topics, of course, in everybody's mind. In particular, they come after a couple of episodes of financial instability, both in the US and Europe. So there might have been reasons for concern. And then, of course, there's still the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. And then, of course, the bigger theme of the decoupling between US and China. So clearly these were the big themes on the table, plus, of course, typical IMF type of discussions on countries needing financial assistance, being Sri Lanka, being Tunisia, and so on and so forth. And so this was the kind of general themes. Now, what I noticed there was kind of a sense of complacency, if I may say. Relaxing, policymakers were relatively, in my opinion, in my view, relaxed. I've been in occasions in which there was an ongoing crisis, the Greek crisis being an example, financial crisis being another one. And of course, at that time, you feel the sense of urgency. You feel people hectically moving from one place to another, trying to figure out how to solve yet another crisis and so on. This was not the case this time around. The environment was generally relaxed, in my view. Yes, there were reasons for concerns, but it seemed like the situation was under control. So that's why I thought, though, that given the potential risks out there, this was a bit of a complacent type of approach that would have required a bit more sense of urgency, if I may.
Sure. And I mean, there's three specific ways that you lay out this sort of sense of
Yeah.
complacency you might be manifesting. But first is inflation. I mean, it's been on our minds for many, many months now. What's the state of it? And do you think it's being almost underestimated as a threat?
I mean, inflation remains clearly in everybody's mind, but the fact that it's peaked in most countries has given the idea that maybe the problem might be resolved. Well, that's not necessarily the case because true, inflation might be going down, maybe not as fast as some people expected, but it's going down. And it might even undershoot the target of central banks for a period, but that's purely for, as people say, base effects. The fact that in the past was higher, now it's lower. So because of that, the year-on-year inflation rate might be going below the target. But in reality, on average, inflation is likely to stay at quite elevated levels, probably around double as much as the central bank targets, which is tends to be between 2.5%, so between 4 and 5%, which is not as comfortable as it used to be. Clearly, it's not as dangerous as double-digit inflation, but it's not as low as governments will, well, especially central banks would like to be, and as what we are used to. If it gets ingrained, then it might creep up higher over time, and this is not what we want. Again, the battle on inflation is not over.
Right. And financial stability, the consequences of the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and what happened subsequently with Credit Suisse. Have we seen the worst of that, or do you think that's still possibly a threat?
No, that's one of the things um that I fear the most, and definitely I will spend a few more words after we discussed the third element on the recession fears, because we have seen short-term fixes, okay, to the problems, both of SVB and Credit Suisse. But I don't think these are long-lasting solutions. I think we are just sowing the seeds for something bigger later on. So that's why I'm saying I think we have seen some episode is not the end of it yet.
Right. And major economies have seemed to have escaped at least for the first half of this year, a full-fledged recession. Why has this happened, and should this put us all at ease?
So that's the third element, as I was saying. So the economy has not gone in a recession as some feared, but economic activity remains extremely weak, prone potentially contract towards the end of the year, and if it's still holding up, is thanks to the still generous fiscal policy to a large extent, even profligate, one may say, even when monetary policy remains relatively tight. So it's kind of artificially kept alive, but also that cannot be last for longer, because if fiscal policy is too generous, then it becomes inflationary, and that defeats the purpose of the central bank activity.
Right. And so we're basically talking about how short-term fixes, really don't solve the structural, more fundamental problem. And when we talk about financial stability, we've seen already what happens with SVB and Credit Suisse, but everyone now has their eyes glued to another entity, to Deutsche Bank, the German one. Tell me more. What are the sort of risks here, and how likely are they to materialize?
So we had 3 episodes, all one different from another. SVB, relatively, well, small, let's say medium-sized American banks, very conservative business model, went under because they did not manage well the interest rate risk. Then the market saw that there was a problem, and so they thought, okay, what's the most problematic bank out there? Clearly it's Credit Suisse, and they turned their eyes on Credit Suisse. Within a space of a couple of weeks, it was in trouble. It needed to be somehow resolved, and we can discuss how it was. Then after that, the market said, okay, who's next? What's the bank that we know it might run into trouble if this situation persists? And that's clearly Deutsche Bank. Somebody made a bet, a small bet, 5 million on CDS, but that was enough to kind of trigger a huge sell-off in European bank equities. That somehow resolved itself out, but clearly the market has pointed the finger to what could be the next one. And that one is a big bank, is systemic, is big enough to change the rules of the game. So that needs to be watched out much more carefully. And the analogy that I'm trying to make in this piece is like the global financial crisis started in November 2006. Then we had the first shakeout in February 2007. Then Northern Rock problems emerged, and you had the run on Northern Rock in September 2007. But Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008. So it took 1 full year before going from something that was localized, idiosyncratic, London-based, actually not even London-based, I would say UK-based, it was from Northern, it was Northern England, to become large, systemic, US-based, something that eventually was risking wiping out the entire financial industry and send the world into a global recession in 2009. So from the first real episode, November 2006, to the economic consequences, there's a span of 3 years. So this is a long-term game. This is a repeated game. This is something that goes in waves. You see some cracks emerging, and then things tend to get worse down the line. So my question to policymakers is, what do you intend to do in this 1 year to make sure that this remains, in fact, a localized issue and doesn't become something systemic, much bigger later on, that requires very different solutions? And yet, that is not something that will happen if policymakers remain complacent, which is the reason why I conclude that moral hazard, unfortunately, so far has proven to always pay off, because policymakers panic when the problem arises. You can't think about moral hazard. You need to save the system. You need to stop contagion. You need to make sure that something is not systemic. Therefore, you act fast, and you put a fix. And the fix is generally something that would become a problem later on. And unfortunately, that's why I'm saying that when complacency is in place and abounds, then moral hazard kind of reigns supreme. So that was kind of, I would say, the summary of my entire thought.
Right. I mean, in a sense, moral hazard as an issue is even more systemic than the very systemic issues that regulators are trying to correct, say in the case of, Deutsche Bank, or if a crisis like that were to erupt. So it's certainly something we'll continue to think about as it develops, perhaps, far from public view, but certainly in a way that its consequences will become quite clear, perhaps in a few months or years' time, in, maybe the worst case scenario. But
I
as
think so.
always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.